Okay, so you want to understand, like a really important thinker, right? You want to get to the core of their ideas,
Yeah.
but without having to slog through a whole bunch of,
Yeah,
really difficult writing.
absolutely.
That's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to take a deep dive into the life and work of Karl Marx. And our mission here is
Yeah.
to pull out those essential insights to help you understand
Yeah,
his lasting impact without, needing a PhD in philosophy.
totally. And to really understand Marx, uh, you have to remember the world that he came from,
Yeah.
right? 1848. I mean, what a year of massive upheaval across Europe.
It's incredible.
Revolutions and unrest stretching all the way from Sicily to Warsaw.
Yeah.
Think about it. The monarchy in France collapsed. Even Metternich, this kind of permanent fixture of European politics,
Right.
had to flee Vienna.
Yeah.
I mean, the old order was really shaking.
I mean, it was a continent in chaos. And the way these uprisings were put down
Yeah.
was so violent. Clara Schumann, the wife of the composer Robert Schumann,
Yeah.
wrote so powerfully from Dresden. She talked about rebels being shot right in the streets, and her landlord told her
Oh, wow.
that his own brother had been forced to watch as soldiers executed 26 students they found in an inn. Then they just started firing
Oh, my gosh.
on people from upper floors of buildings.
Wow.
And her question, it really sticks with you. When will the time come when everyone will have equal rights?
And that's the question Marx was trying to answer.
Yeah.
His solution,
Yeah.
communism.
Right.
And of course, history in the 20th century has given us a pretty clear picture of
Yeah.
how that system worked out in practice.
Yeah. Not exactly what he envisioned.
Not
Yeah, those 20th century communist experiments had some pretty devastating results.
Yes, they did.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Even though his proposed solution failed,
Yeah.
so many of his criticisms of capitalism,
Yeah.
the economic system that he was reacting against,
Yeah.
they still feel relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Those issues of social justice and the extreme inequalities he pointed to,
Yeah.
they haven't disappeared.
I think it's fascinating that, some of his observations still ring so true.
Yep.
I mean, you look at the kind of massive wealth alongside desperate poverty in places like Mumbai or Sao Paulo today.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not just the developing world. Even in wealthy capitalist countries, you see these stark contrasts. Think of those wealthy neighborhoods in major cities,
Right.
just blocks away from areas with significant poverty. Marx would have seen those
Absolutely.
as inherent contradictions in the system.
And that's exactly right. I mean, capitalism has become this global success story. There's no doubt about it.
Of course.
But as Marx argued, it has its costs. And back in his time, the London of Charles Dickens,
Yeah.
those costs were becoming harder and harder to ignore. So the mission of this deep dive is to unpack
Yeah.
Marx's life
Right.
and his core ideas based on the material you've given me to help you understand his lasting impact on how we think about society and economics.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany.
Okay.
And that's in the Rhineland, right near the border with Luxembourg.
Right.
In the Moselle River Valley, a region that's known for its vineyards.
I see.
And growing up in this area, this mix of cultures, and yes, a local appreciation for wine seems to have had an influence on him.
Interesting. So not exactly a starving artist or, a revolutionary in the making. He actually came from a
Yeah.
relatively comfortable
Yes, he did.
middle-class background.
Yeah.
His father, Herschel, who later changed his name to Heinrich,
Right.
was a successful lawyer and owned a couple of small vineyards.
Right.
Fun fact, one of Karl's uncles actually went on to be a co-founder
Oh,
of the huge electronics company Philips.
wow.
So not exactly, a background of hardship.
It's interesting. The father's background, he came from a family of rabbis, but he actually converted to Christianity.
What?
And this wasn't necessarily out of deep religious belief, but more for social reasons.
Oh, interesting.
Similar to figures like Felix Mendelssohn and Heinrich Heine, kind of
Same.
embracing European culture.
Okay.
And Heinrich Marx was a big fan of European culture. Kant and Voltaire were like his intellectual heroes.
So a really interesting blend of German philosophical depth and French
Exactly.
Enlightenment critique.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the political situation where he grew up was also pretty important.
Yeah,
The Rhineland, where Trier is, was annexed by Prussia in 1815.
right.
And a lot of the local liberal population, they saw these new Prussian rulers as autocratic and not really looking out for their best interests. Marx's father was actually involved in a political group
Interesting.
that was pushing for a Prussian constitution.
I see.
So the idea of questioning authority was definitely something that
Right.
he grew up around.
Absolutely.
Then there's that story from his childhood, although I'm not sure if it's actually true or just one of those.
Legends about young Karl making his sisters eat mud pies.
Yeah. Heard that one.
Biographers just,
That's a great detail.
they go back to it again and again. Did it say something about
Yeah.
his later,
Enforcing.
forcing his ideas on the world?
Right.
Who knows? But it's a nice little detail.
It is a great detail.
So when he went to University of Bonn at 18,
Right.
he really threw himself into student life.
Mm.
A huge reader, but also, a big fan of
Yeah.
local wine. And he actually got into a tavern brawl
Oh, wow.
that led to a duel.
Really?
And he actually ended up with a dueling scar. So it wasn't all just books and wine.
Yeah. Right.
Interestingly, he managed to avoid military service because of his health.
Okay.
But the doctor's note was described as somewhat suspicious.
Oh, okay.
So sounds like he knew how to work this system even back then.
Maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
And then we get this fascinating shift when he moved to the University of Berlin a year later, supposedly to continue studying law.
Right.
But it was in Berlin that he discovered philosophy.
Yeah.
And it seems that, everything else kind of took a back seat.
I see.
And Berlin, as the Prussian capital, was a much more serious
Right.
academic environment
Of course.
than Bonn. It was where the influential philosopher Hegel had taught.
Yeah.
And his ideas had become almost like the official philosophy of the Prussian state.
But Hegel had died 5 years before Marx arrived in Berlin.
Right.
And his complex system of thought, this idea of understanding the world through the conflict of opposing ideas,
Yeah.
the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it had already been interpreted in so many different ways
Right.
by his followers.
Yeah.
And some of these left Hegelians were starting to use Hegel's ideas to critique
Right.
the existing Prussian government.
That's right. And Marx attended the official lectures on Hegel's philosophy. But he famously said that he became ill from annoyance
Oh, wow.
at having to worship an idea I detested. And that's kind of ironic because Hegel's way of thinking would become a major influence on Marx, but it was really the dynamic aspect of his thought. The focus on constant change driven by contradiction more than the kind of specific content of Hegel's idealism that really drew Marx in.
So Hegel saw the world and history as this, one big interconnected process,
Yeah.
constantly moving towards what he called the absolute spirit, the totality of everything.
Right.
He even famously said something that could be translated as God is dead in 1827,
Oh, wow.
meaning that the traditional Christian idea of God was being replaced
Yeah.
by this more encompassing absolute spirit.
Pretty radical stuff.
Pretty radical stuff. And what's interesting is that there's this seeming contradiction.
Yeah.
It's conservatism within Hegel's system.
Right.
That despite this seemingly radical statement, his emphasis on this kind of large hierarchical system
Yeah.
really resonated with the Prussian authorities, almost like a justification.
For their bureaucratic state.
Mm.
It was actually Hegel's spiritualism,
Okay.
his kind of religious aspects, and the ultimately conservative conclusions of his system
Okay.
that Marx found so problematic.
And another big influence was Ludwig Feuerbach.
Yeah.
He offered a more, down-to-earth materialist
Yes.
interpretation of Hegel.
Right.
Feuerbach argued that religion wasn't really about humanity's relationship with God, but rather about humanity's
Yeah.
relationship with its own
Right.
essential nature.
Yeah.
He said that, the attributes that we ascribe to God
Yeah.
are really just projections of our own
Yeah.
human qualities.
Exactly.
So when we think about God, we're really just thinking about ourselves.
Right. He essentially took Hegel's idea of the absolute spirit reflecting on itself
Yeah.
and reinterpreted it as humanity's self-awareness, our understanding of our own human nature. He basically removed the spiritual element,
Yes.
made it human-centered and focused on the material world.
And Marx embraced
Yes,
this materialist view, but kind of ironically criticized Feuerbach for not being
Yeah.
Hegelian enough.
Yeah.
He felt that Feuerbach's ideas lack that dynamic historical perspective
Right.
that Hegel provided.
Mm-hmm.
He argued that history and society aren't static, they constantly change
Yeah.
and evolve through conflict.
And then you have the left Hegelians.
Right.
People like Max Stirner, who took Hegel's ideas in even more radical directions.
Right.
Stirner's focus on the individual ego
Yeah.
suggested that, our consciousness actually creates reality, that the individual I is the only real source of meaning.
Okay.
And that things like social class or the state don't have any objective reality.
Pretty individualistic stuff.
Yeah, it is. And what's fascinating is how Marx kind of engaged with all of these ideas.
Right.
He was impressed by Stirner's recognition of the deep link between consciousness and the social and historical world we live in. But he essentially flipped it around. For Marx, it wasn't our individual consciousness that creates our material circumstances, but rather the external material conditions that shape our consciousness, how we think, how we see the world.
So out of all this intellectual activity, Marx started to develop his own philosophy.
Yes, he did.
Trying to bring together these different ideas with a strong focus on materialism.
Right.
And the idea of historical change driven by conflict.
Absolutely.
His aim, as he famously put it, was to turn Hegel on his head.
Yes.
His doctoral thesis focused on Prometheus.
Yes.
The Greek figure who stole fire for humanity and was punished by the gods.
Right.
He clearly saw Prometheus, this figure who could, see the future, as a kind of symbol for his own fate.
Yeah.
The fate of his ideas.
So when Marx finished his university studies, he hoped to get a job as a professor.
Sure.
But the political situation had changed. Frederick William IV became the new Prussian ruler. And he ushered in a much more conservative era. Anyone associated with the left, Hegelians, or radical thought was basically blacklisted from state-run universities. So a career in academia was no longer an option for Marx.
So he had to look around for work, and he found it as a journalist.
Yes, he did.
For a newly established liberal newspaper in Cologne called the Rheinische Zeitung.
Okay.
And even though he'd picked up this rather dense writing style from Hegel, Marx turned out to be a really effective journalist.
Yeah, he was.
And the philosophical background might have given him the complex ideas.
Right.
But the actual practice of writing for a newspaper helped him develop this really sharp, impactful style.
Yeah.
And he became known for coining these memorable and often very cutting phrases.
And he seemed to be a natural leader. He quickly moved up at the paper, became the editor within a year. He was apparently well liked by his colleagues, who nicknamed him the Moor because of his dark complexion and beard. But the Rheinische Zeitung quickly became a problem for the Prussian authorities. Its readership tripled, making it the most widely read paper in Prussia.
Wow. And his own political views were evolving pretty rapidly during this time.
They were.
He started out by criticizing the authorities.
Right.
Then he shifted to criticizing the liberal opposition for not being effective enough.
Right.
And he even took on his own left-wing colleagues.
Yes, he did.
For dismissing the idea of revolution.
Wow.
Despite his influence, in 1843, the Prussian authorities shut down the Rheinische Zeitung for good.
So he's out of a job.
Yeah.
And he makes two seemingly contradictory decisions.
Okay.
First, he decides to settle down and marry his childhood sweetheart,
Okay.
Jenny von Westphalen.
Okay.
Second, he decides to leave his homeland and go into exile.
So Jenny sounds like quite a woman.
Yeah, she was.
She was known as the most beautiful girl in Trier.
Right.
Came from an aristocratic family.
Right.
With really important political connections.
Yeah.
Her father was a high-ranking government official.
Yeah.
Her brother would later become a very repressive interior minister in the Prussian government.
Right.
So what did this, well-bred young woman see in this somewhat, unkempt, argumentative young intellectual who was also 4 years younger than her and Jewish?
Well, Jenny was apparently quite intelligent, well-read, and she was bored with the expected life of a privileged young woman in Trier.
Right.
She wanted something more, and marrying the penniless Marx certainly gave her that, although perhaps not in the comfortable way that she might have initially imagined.
Okay.
But by all accounts, it was a genuine love match. And they remained deeply devoted to each other through all the many hardships they faced.
So after marrying Jenny, Marx took her to Paris.
He did.
Which at the time was really considered the center of revolutionary activity in Europe.
Yeah, of course.
It had already seen those major uprisings.
Right.
In 1789 and 1830.
Yeah.
The city was full of all sorts of, leftist groups.
It was.
And Marx's own ideas had gone through another one of those shifts that you talked about.
Yeah.
He now believed that revolution was the necessary answer.
Right.
And he quickly became involved in the growing communist movement.
And the question is, how would this revolution actually happen?
Right.
Marx felt that a thorough intellectual framework needed to be developed.
Yeah.
And he believed that if politics were to change fundamentally, the underlying economic system also had to be understood and transformed.
Okay.
So he began an intense study of political economy,
Okay.
focusing on the works of Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
Right. The foundational thinkers
Yeah,
of
exactly.
classical economics.
And at the same time, he started to develop his own philosophical understanding of how we know what we know, his epistemology.
Yeah.
Essentially, what is the basis of our knowledge about the world?
Right. And his theory of knowledge is often considered to be one of the
Yeah.
less strong aspects of his overall system.
Yeah,
But it's still important
it is.
because it provides that philosophical grounding
Right.
for his later economic and political ideas.
Yeah.
He wanted to base all knowledge on strictly scientific principles,
Right.
in line with his increasing focus on materialism.
So for Marx, our knowledge begins with our sensory experience of the material world. But his idea of materialism was actually different from earlier thinkers. He saw our perception not as passively receiving information,
Right.
but as an active interaction between us,
Okay.
the subject, and the physical object.
Okay.
In the very act of being known,
Right.
the object is changed.
Okay.
Our perception doesn't reveal some absolute truth of the world, only its appearance to us.
Okay.
So for Marx, our knowledge isn't about discovering some ultimate truth.
Yeah.
It's about developing practical ways to understand and manipulate the natural world,
Okay.
to gain control over it. Knowledge for Marx had a purpose.
It did. It was about action.
And he famously said, the question of whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question.
Yes.
Man must prove the truth, i.e., the reality and power, the decidedness of his thinking in practice,
Right.
which led to his even more famous conclusion.
Yeah.
The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
And that statement has been
Oh, of course.
interpreted in many, many different ways, taken purely as a philosophical statement.
Yeah.
It might seem to dismiss the importance of philosophy itself
Sure.
in favor of, direct political action.
Right.
But within the context of Marx's epistemology,
Okay.
it has a little bit more nuance.
Yeah.
What he's arguing is that ultimate absolute truth might be unattainable.
Right.
We come to understand how the world works through our interactions with it
Yeah.
in order to live in it.
Right. And to shape it. Unfortunately, even understanding his intended meaning,
Yeah.
Marx did seem to want to have it both ways.
Yeah.
Deep philosophical insight
Sure.
and a direct call to political action.
Right. To support himself in Paris, Marx became the editor of a journal called the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher.
Okay.
And through this publication, he connected with another writer who shared many of his evolving ideas, Friedrich Engels.
Right. Engels came from a very different background. His father owned cotton mills in the Rhineland and also in Manchester, England.
Okay, so a factory owner.
Engels, who was in his early 20s at the time, was working in the family business in Manchester, but was also deeply involved in radical politics. He was meeting with Chartists, followers of Robert Owen, and participating in communist gatherings. A really interesting figure in his own right, a kind of a rebel within a business role. Self-taught in, get this, something like 24 languages. Wow.
And living openly with his working-class Irish girlfriend, Mary Burns.
Wow. So quite a character.
Yeah.
And Mary Burns actually gave Engels firsthand exposure to the shocking poverty in the Irish slums of Manchester.
That's right.
These were areas that most middle-class Victorians actively avoided. And these experiences were powerfully documented.
They were.
In his influential book, The Condition of the Working Class in England.
Yeah.
It provides these incredibly vivid and honestly horrifying descriptions of the squalor and dehumanization that he witnessed.
The stark contrast between Engels' privileged upbringing and the brutal realities he saw really fueled his radical beliefs. There's that anecdote where Engels mentioned to a fellow businessman that these slum conditions were a disgrace to Manchester, and the man simply replied,
"Oh my,"
politely, "but a great deal of money has been made here."
Oh, wow.
Good day to you, Mr. Engels.
Oh, God.
Really highlighting that kind of callous indifference that Marx would later critique so strongly.
Interestingly, Marx and Engels actually had a very brief,
They did.
not particularly memorable initial contact
Right.
when Marx was editing the Rheinische Zeitung.
Right.
It wasn't until Engels started submitting articles
Right.
to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher that Marx really recognized him
Right.
as someone who shared his fundamental ideas. When Engels made a short visit to Paris,
Yeah.
a detour on a trip home,
Right.
the cigar-chomping journalist and the communists with business connections quickly discovered their shared intellectual passions.
That initial 10-day meeting in Paris sparked a friendship that would last their entire lives.
And it really is remarkable. Engels was the one close friend that Marx never really had a falling out with.
Exactly.
He deeply admired Marx.
He did.
And would dedicate a significant portion of his life and his personal wealth to supporting his friend.
That's right.
In his work. Absolutely.
Despite being married with a young daughter, Marx continued to live this life of a poor student in Paris, which became a defining feature of his life.
Absolutely.
So not the same extreme, dehumanizing poverty that Engels witnessed in Manchester, but his poverty was always that of the perpetually struggling intellectual, often in desperate need of money, but still operating within a certain sphere of a somewhat irresponsible gentleman.
Marx and Engels began to use the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher as a platform to promote their radical ideas, which started to gain attention in Germany. But the Prussian authorities soon cracked down, confiscating copies of the journal and pressuring the French government to arrest Marx. The journal was shut down, and Marx was expelled from France.
Instead of going back to Germany, he moved to Brussels, Belgium, which had only recently become an independent nation. His family grew to 4 with the birth of a son. Engels soon joined him there.
Yes, he did.
And together they became involved with the newly formed Communist League.
And recognizing their skill as writers, the Communist League asked Marx and Engels to write a statement of principles for the organization, a manifesto. This led to the creation of the famous Communist Manifesto. Now, the name Communist Party in the original title was a bit misleading from the start, as there wasn't really a unified Communist Party at that point. The Communist League was just one of several groups calling themselves communist. And the purpose of the manifesto wasn't just to announce the Communist League's aims, but to actually define what those aims were.
So they had to really bring together all these ideas.
It did, and they had to take these various, often confusing and contradictory ideas that were circulating and forge them into a clear and definitive program.
And they did this with remarkable speed and impact.
Yeah.
The Communist Manifesto, as it's usually called, has become one of the most influential and widely read books in history.
Yes, it has.
Right up there with the Bible and Shakespeare.
Absolutely.
That relatively short 40-page document is really a masterpiece of persuasive writing.
It begins rather dramatically. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism.
Oh, yes, of course. Everyone knows that opening line.
And in an earlier version, Engels actually defined communism as the doctrine of the conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. That class of society which lives solely and exclusively by the sale of its labor. This liberation, they argued, would come through the abolition of private property and its replacement by communal ownership.
And Marx's powerful voice really takes over the document.
It does.
Famously declaring, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
And he traces this conflict from slave societies through feudalism to modern bourgeois society.
Where the bourgeoisie, the owners of factories and resources, dominate the proletariat, the working class, who have only their labor to sell.
So Marx is very clear that there's this fundamental conflict between these two classes in a capitalist system.
And surprisingly, Marx even acknowledges the unprecedented achievements of the bourgeois era. He admits that it has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. But then comes
the critique.
The critique. The bourgeoisie, he argues, has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment.
Right. So it's that reduction of all human relationships
Exactly.
to this purely economic transaction.
He argues that the sacred ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, have been drowned in the icy water of egotistical calculation.
Right.
Personal worth has been reduced to mere exchange value. Freedom has been equated with freedom of commerce, that rich social fabric of pre-industrial life, like you were saying. Places like Trier, where Marx grew up,
absolutely
being replaced by this harsh reality of industrial urban life, as he had witnessed, and the crowded living conditions of students in Berlin and Paris.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.